I think A-OK. Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to our fourth E4 Brown Bag of the 2025 school year. I'm Paul Gorin. I'm the director of the E4 Center, and it's really great to have you here. Today, we're continuing a series of discussions involving colleagues from the E4 Center, the School of Education and Social Policy here at Northwestern, Curriculum Associates, and our district partner. This initiative originated from the E4 Center's first annual convening in May of 2023, where we formed a learning community with members of the Chicago Public Schools, Oakland, California Public Schools, and several other school districts. The key takeaway from that session was a unanimous desire to do more in-person events, and importantly, to create and sustain our learning community over time. One way we are fostering an ongoing learning community is through a series of virtual brown bag discussions on a range of topics like we're doing today. This is our fourth brown bag of the academic year. We look forward to seeing you back here for our last E4 brown bag on April 10th at noon Central to hear from the Chicago Public Schools mathematics team. We also want to let you know that our previous brown bags are available on our website at e4.northwestern.edu. Today's presentation will also be available in the near future. We will let you know when it's up on the website. For our fourth session of the 24-25 school year, we're excited to welcome Dr. Chloe Gibbs. Dr. Gibbs is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Notre Dame, where she studies the economics of education and is interested in measuring the effects, both intended and unintended, of policies and programs targeted at disadvantaged children and families. Dr. Gibbs' research includes investigating the intergenerational transmission of Head Start effects, understanding the role of publicly funded education in facilitating maternal employment, and exploring the role of soft skills in children's education and labor market trajectories. Professor Gibbs earned her BA at Notre Dame and a PhD at the University of Chicago's Harris School. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and cited by the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNBC, and NPR, among other services. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Chloe Gibbs, and welcome.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone for being with us, for joining us. I did not realize when we were scheduling that I was going to be in the same time slot as the opening rounds of the NCAA tournament, which is difficult to compete with. So I appreciate you being here. I won't be too offended if you have dual screens going during this talk. So thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to talk about some joint work that I've conducted in collaboration with Phil Oriopoulos, Michael Jensen, who's a graduate student here at Notre Dame, and Joe Price on how to support teachers in using computer-assisted learning effectively. Oh, see, there we go. All right, and I have to start with some important acknowledgments. Let me also say that I'm happy to take questions throughout, so please jump in if you have any questions or try to flag me down. I'll try to keep an eye on it. So I want to thank our great partners in this work. We worked with two school districts, the Metro Nashville Public Schools in Tennessee and the Arlington Independent School District in Texas, who were really vital to us being able to carry out this work, and who were great partners, both in terms of implementation and in terms of allowing researchers access to data and facilitating that process. We also worked with Khan Academy, and in particular, I want to thank Kelly Hill at Khan for helping us to conduct this work. We have a number of funders that supported our work that we are very grateful to, excellent research assistants and project managers. And then we have a coaching team that I'll talk more about, which we call Coaches with a K, to be clever with our Khan Academy partner. I wondered if I should actually change my name to Chloe with a K to be in keeping with the project. But so you'll see that term Coaches throughout. We had about 30 coaches who were excellent. And then, of course, to our over 200 participating teachers, to their students and their families, we are very grateful. All right, so Wrong way. There we go. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the motivation for this work. And then I'm going to walk you through sort of the component parts of our big research project. First, we have a smaller scale proof of concept experiment that we conducted with the Metro Nashville Public Schools, and then a much broader scale up experiment in Arlington, Texas. And so I'll walk through both of those component parts. And then in the Arlington data, what we do are what we call quasi-experimental analyses, but really we really probe the data to understand implementation and to better get a sense of what may be driving effectiveness of this kind of a program. And I'll discuss the implications then of that work. So I don't have to tell everyone on this call, but one of the fundamental challenges in education is that students come from different starting points and that they maybe grow at different rates. That is, students have different skill levels and growth rates and skills. And we certainly saw this very acutely during the pandemic. And that these differentials may also be related to various student characteristics such that different skill levels at entry and different growth rates then might correspond to growing inequity by socioeconomic status, by other measures of disadvantage. And so understanding sort of how to work with this kind of variation in skill level, I think is a really fundamental challenge. So some ingredients of what might be a promising pedagogical solution to this in the form of personalized instruction, intensive support. So you can think about sort of in the limit, the most intensive version of this, one teacher for every student, kind of how we think about classical education as it occurred in institutions of higher education when they were founded, sort of this pairing of mentor and student. So that's kind of the most intensive version. Continuous support, that is that it's happening daily, that there's sufficient time for skill development, and that the teacher is available to answer questions, that the support is high quality. In particular, we might think of a mastery approach in which students master particular skills before moving on to subsequent skills, and clear instruction, encouragement, feedback, and that the support is isolated in that it is away from distraction. So these are some of the features that we might think important to personalized instruction. But as I'm walking through those, of course, we're thinking this is quite expensive, quite difficult to scale. And so we've seen a lot of evidence on supplemental tutoring where we see one-on-one or small group instructional programming that could be provided by teachers, by paraprofessionals, volunteers, even parents, that allows students to progress at their own pace and has this feature of immediate feedback and attention. Tutoring is, of course, expensive and difficult to scale, but overall benefits have proven to be impressive in a variety of settings. And in particular, my co-author was engaged in a review of 96 RCTs, so 96 experiments that found sizable positive effects on learning outcomes, an average effect size of nearly 30% of a standard deviation, which to sort of characterize standard deviations, which I will use throughout this presentation. I'm sure many are familiar with them, but when we think about using this kind of standardized unit, a couple things that I can help peg that to. One is that the Tennessee Project STAR class size reduction experiment, which is widely heralded in education as a very effective intervention at improving student test score outcomes, generated about 20% of a standard deviation, or 0.2 standard deviations of test score response to the intervention. Sometimes people will equate these to months of learning, where 30% of a standard deviation might be something like 3 months of learning. I'm not particularly wedded to that kind of a translation, but to give you a sense, this would be considered quite large in the education literature. Usually these are as measured by English or math scores. So you can see sort of the array of tutoring programs by the effect size that they generate, with a lot of the evidence sort of coalescing around these rather large effect sizes over on the right-hand side of this figure. And in general, what their synthesis found is that there's larger average impact for programs that occur during school, with teacher or paraprofessional serving as the tutor, with a one-on-one ratio, and frequently, so 3 to 5 days a week. But importantly, I want to note that there's still, in this body of evidence, an average effect size that exceeds 20% of a standard deviation, even when it occurs after school or with volunteer tutors or with a larger ratio, something like 1 to 3, and less frequently, so 1 to 2 days a week. So still rather impressive effect sizes, though not quite as large in the literature in those cases. So the challenges, though, of course, with scaling tutoring efforts are that it is expensive and that the supply of tutors is somewhat limited and of varying quality. So finding enough tutors, whether they're volunteers or paid, it can be difficult to determine sort of when and how to provide tutoring such that students are most engaged in it. And we have a fair amount of evidence of low demand or sort of low take up when tutoring is offered after school. And there is, of course, after school or outside of school, a lack of structure for sort of how tutoring might take place. So into this conversation, I want to bring computer-assisted learning. So Cal, as I'll now refer to it, offers the potential for simulating a tutoring experience, perhaps at larger scale. And we might think of this as kind of an alternative solution to this issue of providing instructional support, promoting practice, but being able to do so, as I said, at scale. So an example of Cal is Khan Academy, which provides a customizable roadmap of incremental short math videos and exercises for students in grades 3 to 12, and they're always expanding their offerings. But for our purposes, that's going to be the relevant set of videos and exercises. Students can progress at their own pace. They receive immediate feedback and help in the interface itself. And it really emphasizes the mastery approach. That is, you keep trying until successfully completing the exercises. And others, teachers, parents, tutors, can observe student progress and intervene if the student is stuck. So it has some of these features that we've been talking about in a more personalized education setup, and potentially offers them at broader scale. And so my co-author, again, has done a summary of what we know about the impact of computer-assisted learning, in particular on math outcomes. And you can see a range of impact estimates from these various types of programs. And they range a lot in terms of their component parts and what they look like and how they were implemented. But to, sort of give you a sense of what the literature says in general, small scale pilot programs for the most part is what we're looking at here, mostly in developed countries, suggest that Cal could be an effective way to improve math skills. And indeed, 12 of 19 randomized control trials of math-oriented Cal found effects that range from 0.14 to 0.56 of a standard deviation, with an average around 20% or a fifth of a standard deviation. Synthesized in this review. And so again, promising evidence that these effects can be quite large from engaging with these tools. But of course, there's challenges to scaling Cal as well. So students might not be motivated to use it, particularly outside of school. Incorporating technology, of course, requires changes from those who are delivering education. So they have to adjust their instruction and figure out how to incorporate it alongside what they may usually do. Teachers and parents may not feel familiar with it or concerned about the additional effort that they'll have to put in to incorporate it, particularly for teachers relative to kind of what they have done before. And of course, people have limited bandwidth to incorporate new things in busy schedules. We might also be concerned about limited computer access both in school, although there are of course ways we can address that, but also at home when implementing Cal. And so our proposed solution that I'm going to walk through some evidence on is essentially supporting teachers in using Cal effectively. And so the research question that we sought to answer in this work is, can we indeed support teachers such that they can integrate Cal alongside their classroom instruction in ways that generate improvements for students' math learning? And we're going to do that through, as I mentioned, these two different experimental contexts. So the first experiment is going to be a week-long student-level proof of concept, what we call a proof of concept experiment in Nashville. And I'll preview the findings and then walk through them in a little more detail. What we see is that math performance improves. It's indeed concentrated among students who were in classrooms with high average engagement with Khan Academy, with high interaction with Khan. In the longer experiment, so here we're going to conduct a school year long experiment at the teacher level in which teachers are randomly assigned into receiving support alongside their integration of Khan Academy. in Arlington, Texas. What we also see there is math test score improvements for elementary school students, but we see actually no effect for middle school students. And the main difference appears to be that there is far less practice time, far less engagement with Khan in middle school. And I'll talk more about that. And then when we move to trying to understand implementation in more detail, what we see is that test score improvements are realized for students in classrooms where the teacher facilitates sufficient practice time. Now, I want to be clear, the amount of practice time that teachers engaged in is, of course, not randomly assigned in our experiment. The support that we provided to teachers was indeed randomly assigned. So this investigation is a little more tricky to sort of unpack in that we need to understand what teachers who facilitate a lot of practice time are doing, what drives that, and I'll talk a little bit about our conversations with teachers to understand that. So we essentially developed an intervention called Coaching with Khan Academy, or QUIC. And the idea behind QUIC was to motivate and support teachers in using CAL. In particular, we're going to use Khan Academy. It's free, which was the appeal to us. It's free to students who may want to practice more at home. It's free to teachers to engage with. We did enlist the support of Khan in getting data on teachers' interactions with the system and in being able to provide teachers with what was happening in the Khan interface among their students, which is an additional piece sort of over and above what the public usually interacts with on Khan. And so we wanted to help teachers in integrating this as part of their instruction. The key sort of ingredient from our perspective is that we have this team of coaches to essentially help get them up and running. And we had in mind also to support them throughout the year, though I'll say that piece proved to be less important. Sort of once we had teachers kind of familiar with how to do so, they engaged with the coaches less. So coaches met with teachers weekly. The idea was that it would be weekly throughout the year, although that kind of, as I said, tapered off, but also helped them to troubleshoot issues and discuss best practices. And the coaches also helped to monitor and interpret the data that was coming out of Khan so that they could understand sort of what students were doing and their engagement and identify for teachers students who might need attention. The coaches also help teachers construct a roadmap of the activities that would map on, the activities and videos that would map on to what they were doing in the classroom or align well with what was happening in the classroom. Students work at their own pace. The program's flexible. The coach works with the teacher to modify the roadmap, to use assignments or customize the roadmap for each student. And so what does the teacher role look like in this? The teacher creates a mastery goal that essentially sets up the roadmap for students to follow and the set of exercises that they'll work through. They encourage students to work on their mastery goal at least an hour a week. And we ask them to demonstrate an exercise live in the class each week to sort of help remind students how it worked. And in particular, sort of the importance of making mistakes, getting the feedback, trying again, sort of this resilience and persistence through the exercises. So we ask them to demonstrate that to the extent they were able in class. And then they monitor progress. They help those that are struggling. They may praise improvement. They could, and we asked them to the extent they could, integrate it, providing class time for Khan Academy activities. Some of them were constrained in whether or not they had the ability to use Chromebooks and that sort of thing to do that. And then we also asked them to communicate with parents to also potentially facilitate some at-home use. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to go to Nashville and do this week-long experiment where we want to sort of demonstrate that this maybe can work in moving students' math skills. So in March of 2022, we essentially ran this approach in 7 Metro Nashville public middle schools, what were called schools of innovation, with about 50 math teachers in the middle school grades. Our goal was really to demonstrate whether sort of a mini version of QUIC, that is just a week-long version, could move math performance. And so we had about 3,000 potential participants in grades 6 through 8. That is 3,000 students in the classrooms of these 50 math teachers. And what we did was within a student, we randomly assigned them to one of 2 grade-specific topics to work on over the course of the week. These topics were identified by the school district as topics that would be on upcoming, you can see we ran this in March, on the upcoming standardized tests that students would take in April in the district. And so they were grade level specific and they were oriented towards what students would need to know and be able to do on those upcoming assessments. So during class, students took a pretest on both of the topics. That is their focal topic that they would practice and another topic for their grade level that they would not practice. And then they were given about an hour of Khan Academy activities and videos on their topic to complete that week. And a week later, teachers gave them class time to essentially wrap up and take a post-test. Again, on both of the skills, this focal skill and the other skill that they didn't practice. So this is essentially the flow chart, but I just kind of walked you through. All of the students were assigned to either topic A or topic B, which was grade level specific. Then they do their work throughout the week. Some engaged more with Khan Academy than others. I'll talk more about that. And they work through the activities, and a week later, they take the post test. So you should think of student scores on their practice topic as the treatment outcome. And then, of course, they have this other topic, this unpracticed topic, that we consider the control outcome. Here's what it looked like. So they essentially go into this interface that we created. It says we want to work on some math topics, in particular for your upcoming TCAP achievement tests. If you don't know a question, just skip, but essentially it's a 6-question quiz. So it's a very short pretest. We didn't want it to be particularly burdensome. Here's an example for grade 8. Topic A was solving equations. And so here's an example of a question that they might encounter. And once they finish the pretest, they're immediately taken to this page, which says essentially, now let's practice. And so the idea being that if teachers were providing enough time right then, they could go ahead and start moving through the Khan Academy lessons. So they had a student-specific username and password such that then when they went in, they saw their focal topic, their assignments that they could then work through. So here's an example, grade 6, topic B was dividing fractions, and you can see what the assignments were for a student who was assigned to this particular topic. What we see is that about 71% of students watched the first exercise, and then that sort of tapers off in terms of attempting. So watch the first video, attempting the first exercise, and then achieving a level of familiarity or above 80% on the items pertaining to that exercise. Only about half of them got to that point. And then as you move to the other exercises, similarly, you sort of see this fall off. Fewer students watched the first exercise, although still more than half attempted the items associated with it, and 30% became familiar. And then by exercise 3, only about a quarter of students make it to familiarity on the third exercise. So some drop off across the week in terms of engagement with the interface. But what we see when we then look at these post-tested skills on the focal topics that students worked is over a fifth of a standard deviation improvement in math skills on our assessment. That's statistically significant, as you can see. Interestingly enough, there was some heterogeneity or variation by grade level, quite large effects in the 6th grade and in the 8th grade, smaller effects, though still positive and still statistically significant among 7th graders. What we see when we look by average class practice, so this is, I'm in a class that also happened to practice, is practicing more. The teacher facilitated more practice, larger effects in the classrooms with more practice in that week. Similarly, by level ups, moving through the exercises and leveling up to the next skill, you can see classrooms that had higher on average level ups, students in those classrooms had higher, larger effects. And by the number of activities mastered. Quite large effects for those students who persisted to the end of the third exercise and mastered all 3 exercises to which they were assigned. And you can see this when we look at average class practice time here on the x-axis and the average class effect, that is the treatment effect. There really is this sort of pattern that as the average class practice time increases, that we see some evidence of larger effects on average. So what are the big takeaways from this week-long proof of concept? So using Khan Academy for reinforcing increasingly challenging math concepts, we think can significantly improve math performance. Implementation fidelity appears critical. So that is, if teachers facilitate sufficient practice time, students have the opportunity to complete these level ups to master material and keep moving through. The effect sizes are impressively large when this happens, similar to what we see in high dosage tutoring. Remember, this is a very small duration experiment. So I want to add a couple caveats. One, the short time horizon between practice and test. And remember that indeed the test is very proximal to the skills. We constructed the pre-test and the post-test to measure these particular skills. And remember, too, that the counterfactual is not practicing the focal skill. So that could be because a student was assigned to a different topic via our random assignment, but it could also be that the time intended for practice was used inefficiently or teacher chose to use time differently. And so, this is just essentially to demonstrate that engagement with Khan can lead to improvements in math skills. So now I want to move to where we scale up in Arlington, where we run our larger experiment. So at the end of the 2020-21 school year, you can remember a time in which school districts were very concerned about student learning setbacks and very interested in ways to potentially supplement instruction and assist particularly students who were struggling with getting back on track. And so we contacted all the math teachers in grades 3 through 8 in the Arlington School District about their interest in using Cal program for their class the following school year. So this would be in the 21 to 2022 school year. 312 teachers expressed interest, and we grouped them into 180 grade by school units. Essentially, we were concerned that we didn't want to have a teacher in the treatment group who was in the same, sort of grade level team teaching alongside another teacher, or maybe co-teaching in ways that that might make it obviously useful to them to both be doing the same thing. And so we grouped them together for deciding who was in the treatment. So after randomization, which was stratified by grade level, there were 160 control teachers, and we offered them the program in the following year. So they were selected to receive the program during the 2022-23 school year. And so for our focal year, they were in the control group, and we told them we would contact them later, essentially, which we then subsequently did. The sample was 224 teachers in 156 grade by school teams of about 10,000 students. And so a little bit about implementation. Treatment teachers were given training on Quick during their district professional development before the start of the school year. So this is like a 2-day district professional development. We had a chunk of a short time in that 2-day window to introduce them to Quick. We had our 33 coaches hired to provide support to them. These were, for the most part, undergraduate students from our own institutions and also from institutions in Texas and in Tennessee, where we reached out to friends of ours to find outstanding undergrad students who had good interpersonal skills, were excited to engage in an education-related effort. And all the coaching was done virtually. Coaches were trained to provide technical support. This training, again, was pretty light touch. We did about a 2-hour training with them to get them familiar with Khan Academy, with the available data, that sort of thing. And they were really intended to just sort of keep teachers accountable, to keep them on track, to be checking in with them. And as I mentioned, these meetings happen virtually, weekly to start the school year, moved to monthly or even less frequently as teachers adjusted, which most teachers did move to sort of a less frequent cadence. So we should say that from the outset, we were getting a lot of feedback that there was evidence that grades 3 through 6, in our context, those are the elementary grades, and in 7-8, middle school or junior high, operated pretty differently. And so you can see that in grades 3 through 6, the average number of students per teacher, about nearly 44 students, but in grades 7 through 8, not surprisingly, much higher, about 88 students per teacher. And elementary classrooms had this blocked 70 minutes a day for math, but teachers had flexibility in sort of how they used that. And if they had those students for longer in the day, which in many cases they did, they could adjust because those students were in the same classroom for multiple subjects. And they also had additional set aside enrichment time throughout the week that teachers could use for any subject. We found, and we heard from our teachers, that they often would use that for their Khan Academy practice, whereas middle school classrooms had only 50 minutes a day with their math students, and those students were rotating to other classes, so without much flexibility. And many teachers expressed disinterest in assigning Khan as homework, especially given the lack of technology access in some homes. So we sensed that there were some differences in how this was being implemented in the elementary grades and in the middle school, junior high grades. And indeed, you see that when you look at average weekly practice time. You can see for grades 7 to 8 on the right-hand side, clustered at very low minutes, in particular, right around 5 minutes average weekly practice time, whereas there's much more of a distribution in the elementary grades with some very high numbers of weekly practice minutes, whereas you don't see that for the older grades. Similarly, when you look at level ups, the skills that are leveled up on average in a week, the average for the modal number for in grades 7 through 8 was 0 level up. So far less engagement with Khan Academy. Oh, sorry. Let's just move to this pictorially because it's a little easier to see. And so here are the results. What we see is on average, nothing. So essentially 0, null effect when we have all the grades pulled together. But when we break that out into looking at the younger grades separately, we see a positive statistically significant effect as measured by the state standardized test at the end of the year, the state standardized math test, the STAR test in Texas. And so that you should think of as not being particularly sort of aligned with what we were doing through Quick, but that we're seeing evidence that it translates over to that state standardized test for the younger grades. What we see in the older grades is in fact a negative sign, but it's not statistically significant, so we can't say much about that. But perhaps some suggestion that devoting a little bit of time is actually worse because that's crowding out something that you would have otherwise done. And I want to be mindful of time. So here are the main takeaways. Overall, this null effect on student math scores in our Arlington experiment, but the full sample result masks what we think are important differences in what's happening in the elementary grades and what's happening in the middle schools. And those differences correspond to pretty pronounced differences in practice time. In elementary schools where average practice time was more than 30 minutes a week, math scores were considerably higher for students in treated classrooms. But as we saw in middle school classrooms where practice time averaged fewer than 10 minutes a week, point estimates were negative. And quite sizable, although I'll note not statistically significant. Given the little time middle school math teachers have with students and their avoidance of giving homework via Khan Academy, we think there's just insufficient time for students to really sort of leverage this mastery approach in ways that are useful to them or helpful to them, which is indeed perhaps the negative sign we see suggests worse than what they would otherwise do. And so we think the same conclusion as Nashville largely, that the implementation fidelity is critical, that teachers need to facilitate sufficient practice time for students to master the material and to have this sort of try again feedback loop until they master the skills. And so just a couple notes I want to make on understanding implementation. So we're gonna essentially use a quasi-experimental approach to explore sort of who is generating these good test score outcomes. We might be concerned in particular about the caveat at the bottom of the slide, are good teachers the same ones who facilitate more Khan Academy practice time? Because indeed what we see is again the pattern that we saw in Nashville, which is more minutes in the top panel associated with better outcomes as you move across the distribution. And similarly in the bottom panels, more being in a classroom that has higher average practice time is associated with these better outcomes. We turn to talking to teachers to also understand that, and high practice teachers mentioned a strong sense of buy-in from the beginning of the program, and importantly, support for that from their building leaders and from district leaders. They had a plan for when they were going to integrate practice every week. And we heard a lot from particularly elementary school teachers that they often use free time in the classroom. So they sort of built this in as their thing that would fill that free time to the extent it came up, and that they would rely on things like candy, stickers, leaderboards, sometimes grades as incentives to encourage student engagement, and that they talked to us about closely monitoring student activity in Khan. So they really kept track of that data. And so we think the broad conclusions are that Cal offers the potential to provide this kind of personalized support at scale that I talked about in motivating this work, and to then lead to improvements in student math outcomes. But there's high variance around teacher facilitation of that kind of high dosage practice that may be necessary to realize those good outcomes. The potential for greater practice with the high buy-in, the dedicated practice time close monitoring and quality supervision and encouragement seems quite high. And I do want to just close with sort of two sort of hot off the presses results. And one is that we have gotten from the district two sort of new data points. One is the subsequent year's outcomes for students. And when we look at the next year, when they are not necessarily in a quick teacher's classroom anymore, and we were not involved in the experimental capacity at that point. We see persistence of these effects. So we see among students who had been in treatment teachers' classrooms that they still are outperforming the control group students the following year. The other thing that we've done is we've gotten a prior year of data on our teachers and their students' performance in the prior year to see if it is indeed the high practice teachers who were the higher performing teachers before coming into the experiment. We see that at the very, very high end. That is that the teachers who were facilitating very high levels, lots of minutes of practice are indeed the teachers who exhibited higher student performance in the prior year, but not actually for most of the distribution of practice time. So it really is only concentrated among the very top, where we see that those are some high performing teachers that are using a lot of minutes, facilitating a lot of minutes. So we still think that there's a lot of room for encouraging this kind of integration of Cal and supporting teachers in doing so to move student performance. And with that, I would love to turn to questions.
Thank you so much, Chloe. This was wonderful. Definitely, yeah, want to open it up. If anyone has a question, feel free to just unmute and chime in.
Well, I'd be happy to kick us off with the first question. So thanks again, Chloe. This was very interesting. One thing I'm wondering about, especially as you were sharing the elementary like the positive results among elementary teachers in grades 3 through 6, have you, or I guess I'm wondering if you've been able to collect any data on teachers' sense of like self-efficacy in math or identity, and I'm wondering to like what extent that might help explain some of these results if there's variation across that measure. Is that something you might have the ability to look into more?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do have a baseline survey where we ask teachers some questions about their confidence in math instruction. We also ask some questions about prior use of Khan Academy, some things like that we have not probed those as much as sources of some of that variation. So I think it's a good suggestion and something we certainly could do. I mean, I will say that I don't think we have particularly rich measures of understanding a teacher's self-efficacy and some of those, I think, important measures. But you could imagine, I think it's an important open question because it's not clear to me, at least I sort of don't have a prior about which direction that would go. If teachers who are sort of more confident with their math instruction feel more able to integrate Khan effectively and sort of be more almost limber to like use that as a tool and their normal instruction and use those as complements. But or if it would be teachers who feel perhaps more anxious and they can then use this tool as helpful to them in sort of scaffolding, supporting their instruction. So I don't have a clear prior, and as I said, I think our measures are somewhat limited, but we do have those in a pre-intervention survey that we took with teachers.
I was going to ask a parallel question, sort of the understanding in more detail the training that teachers have either at the elementary or middle school level, and again, if you could dig into the district data, the teachers who are getting a lot better results in their classrooms, what are their characteristics? How long have they been in the field? And again, what capacities do they bring? I guess I do have a question, which is, was the actual technical assistance training for the elementary teachers the same as it was for the middle school teachers?
Good question. Yes. So we had we had the same training, and then we had the same set of coaches. So our coaches could have been working with a third grade teacher and an eighth grade teacher. Each coach had, approximately 5 teachers with whom they were working. And so what we were delivering from our perspective looked the same. I think to your point about district training, though, obviously there are going to be different trainings they're receiving, and that the way that might interact with what we were providing could look different across those younger grades, of course, and the middle school grades. They were all, this is, I think, one of the challenges of these kinds of interventions and this kind of study is that, they were, of course, expected to continue doing everything that the district was asking of them. And so that's a reason why we're so grateful to our district partners in this work for sort of letting us slide this in alongside everything else that teachers were doing. And so we tried to make our efforts as relatively unburdensome as possible, and we really wanted to demonstrate to teachers that this was intended to be supportive and not really provide a whole bunch of extra work. And so that was really kind of the role of the coaches, was to say, like, look, I already pulled all the data for you. Here it is. If you want to look at what students have been up to, let me flag for you that these students have been really excelling, and these, so it was really intended to lighten the load to some extent for teachers. But of course, that's alongside everything else they're doing. To your question, Paul, about other data, we have, sort of other characteristics of teachers. We have a limited set of those characteristics. And so given that we don't have a huge sample of teachers, it becomes a little bit difficult for us to parse along a lot of these dimensions. Experience is something we want to look at, and it is something we don't currently have. So we have asked the district about that. They're somewhat reluctant to share, understandably, data that's sort of more about personnel, and more kind of in the realm of HR. And also, of course, that data would be somewhat limited in that we wouldn't observe sort of the full tenure a teacher may have had in their career. And so we're trying to think about ways to handle that. So if people have ideas, we've tried to think about other data sets where we could observe teachers' time in the field in Texas, because I think that's another interesting one, is thinking about sort of the more experienced teachers versus more newcomers, and how this works for them.
Um, Hey, I had a question that I think the treatment effect from the elementary school cohort could be because of adding more after school working, like homework time, like learning time. I know like there's probably not a way like to measure it. And I guess since they added it, let's just assume that that was the mechanism, like they added more work learning time, and so there could be like some sort of other spillover effect. I guess I was just wondering, like, is there a way like to look into like if there's an effect on other test score, like subjects test scores?
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Um,
So yeah, a good question. I'll just point out, though, that actually across grade levels, our teachers were pretty reluctant to assign homework. At the earlier grades, that was largely because of concerns about that they in general didn't assign a lot of homework. They didn't want to add this to even if they were going to assign homework. And then there were concerns across the board about access to computers at home and to the internet and those sorts of things. So in general, that was that characterized kind of our full sample, was this reluctance to assign this as homework. What we think, to your point about instructional time, though, is that I do think what was happening was that this elementary teachers had more flexibility to integrate this throughout the day. And so I think they were crowding out maybe sort of less structured time that would have otherwise been kind of free time, or transitions throughout the day. They were kind of using those to have students work on con. And so I do think, you could sort of think of that as increasing the instructional minutes in the school day to the extent we were sort of using time differently. But I don't think it's driven off of a lot of out of school time increase. I actually think we could probably show you that directly from our data because we know in con when the use was. And so I think we could actually show you to convince you of that point, but I think it's a good point. And then I think the other question is interesting. We haven't really thought about asking for sort of other test scores to think about whether this could also potentially affect student performance in other areas. But we could probably do that. We could probably work with the district to think about that.
I had a just very quick sorry, go ahead, Michael. Yeah, I had a very quick follow-up question. Like,
Yeah.
you have a plan like to look into longer term effect of for the experiment? You know,
We
I'd
would
be
love
interested. Yeah.
We'd love to. That'll obviously be contingent on our relationship with the district going forward. They've been great partners, but we also recognize that we've asked them for a lot over time. So as I mentioned, we just got an additional year from them, and to the extent that they'll tolerate us in subsequent years, we will probably come back asking again.
Thank you for this, Chloe. I'm trying to think about students' experiences. And you mentioned that with the computer-assisted learning, students could receive feedback. Were you relying on sort of the built-in feedback mechanisms of Khan Academy? Is it possible, in addition to important but not shocking finding that the more time that learners spent with the program, the more they learned. Is it possible that middle grade students thought the feedback was boring, whereas elementary students thought it was helpful? Do you have sort of thoughts about trying to better understand students' experiences with it, in addition to the importance of time with it?
Yeah, that's a great question because, of course, we cannot observe in what we currently have how much of this is like students just drop off because it's they don't want to continue doing it versus they weren't encouraged to, the teacher didn't provide time, sort of it could be both of those things that we're observing at the middle school level. And I think you're right to sort of I think it would be interesting to probe more in terms of how students at different grade levels interact with Khan, how well the feedback part, which is automated in the system. So that's a primary way in which they're getting feedback. The other piece is, of course, that we are trying to encourage teachers to also be checking in. So to the extent that they see progress, to be sort of rewarding it or encouraging, or to the extent they see somebody stalling out to check in with them too. So, we do think that the online feedback though is the most direct mechanism that you can be working at your own pace and you're getting the feedback in real time. We have not actually thought about, and of course we don't have the institutional review board approval to talk to students directly, but my sense is that Khan Academy is working on this through other research projects to better sort of understand how students interact. And this is, of course, becoming even more salient now that there are AI tools that will generate feedback in different ways, right? That are more sort of personalized or that may be, sort of deemed more responsive. And so I'd be interested in sort of whether that novelty improves the student experience for older kids in ways that sort of make it more interesting to them or more useful to them. But I think you draw on an important point that is, we're sort of operating at the teacher level here. And so we understand from our teacher interviews and from our engagement with them about how sort of it worked for them. We have less understanding at the student level of their experiences.
I have a question, Chloe.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm a fan of this paper. I think what you guys did was really, really good. I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about scaling this beyond the profile of teachers you were able to attract? So I think my first question is to understand a little bit how do you think how selected is the 300-ish teachers that you had? And how do you think, are they ultra motivated to use technology in classrooms and getting to them? Is this the best we can do? And then we should expect you know, at scale up? You know, like how should we think about the profile of the teacher track? I know you don't have a lot of information. You might have priors and thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, of course, there is this tension between sort of like tightly controlling the experiment and being able to sort of, randomly assign teachers to getting the support and not getting the support. But also, and then of course, our sort of ethical obligations to engage with teachers in ways that are aligned with what the district's doing, appropriate, all of those things. And then sort of thinking about, okay, then what does this group of teachers that we were able to recruit for our study tell us about sort of teachers more broadly? So I have a couple thoughts about that. One is that on the data that we do observe, I will say that these teachers do not seem to be systematically sorted in some of the ways that you might worry. There's a range of prior performance. We did have some relatively new teachers and some longer term teachers, although we don't officially observe their number of years in the district. But from talking to them, we didn't have any brand new teachers because in our setup, we of course recruited them in the prior year. So we didn't have any brand new entering teachers. We also asked them about their prior con use, and that was actually quite varied. So, you might worry that sort of the only people that would say, yes, I'm interested, might be people who have some prior exposure or sort of, and we had some people who had never used it before. So from that perspective, I think we got sort of teachers across some distributions, but my concern is that, of course, the teachers that raise their hands and say that they want to do this are going to be the most motivated to implement it. We don't actually see that in the data. There are some teachers that don't really implement it much and didn't engage with our coaches once they were in. But I do think that that the district encouraging them to participate. I think the level of support that we did offer an incentive for attending the training and for the first couple of meetings with the coach to ensure that they felt like their effort was being sort of offset with an incentive. And as I said, we said, if you don't get it this year, you'll get it next year. And so I think all of those pieces, I think, encouraged a pretty wide swath of teachers to join up. Thinking about scale, I mean, I think it's fair to say that if you sort of offer this to everyone or embed this in a district, that my expectation would be smaller effect sizes and lower overall engagement. So I think then we get to the point where we think about the engagement piece being critical. So how do we facilitate that? And at scale, how do we support teachers in being able to use this in ways? And I think that what comes through in the interviews is time, giving teachers some flexibility around time or helping them find the time in the day. This like flex enrichment period that the elementary schools had was vital for teachers. They said, oh, this turned out to be the thing I would use the enrichment time for. And so it was perfect. So I think, thinking about the ways that even for teachers who maybe are not particularly motivated when trying to scale this, I think thinking about the ways that you structure it for them, you make it as sort of simple as possible. And again, I think the coaching was a key element here. It wasn't super expensive. It wasn't super intensive, but it just was enough support that the teachers felt like they could ask a question if they had a question about the technology, they could see the data, even if they didn't have time to go in and pull it. And that kind of got them this sort of springboard into implementation in ways that don't have to be, as I said, super intensive or comprehensive over the year, but I think just sets them up well for success. So all that to say, I wish I could, like, in my crystal ball, sort of have a better sense of what this would look like at broader scale. But I think we did it pretty large scale in the district. I think it was helpful that the district was on board and was communicating that to teachers. And I think that, sort of some of the same supports and structures that we saw to be particularly relevant here would be even more relevant when trying to scale this up with a broader population of teachers.
We've got time for maybe one more question.
And I will say the working paper version is available on my website, and is an NBER working paper. So if you want to take a look, if you have any more questions, you should feel free to reach out to me. And in the paper, we have a lot of quotes from teachers that sort of help us understand how this worked for them, which I think was really useful to us as researchers who are sometimes so far removed from the actual implementation of these kinds of things. So that was, I think, really useful.
I don't actually have a question, but I think Michael's point from earlier, the difference between elementary and middle school, is something really interesting to explore from the user point of view. What does the typical elementary school kid, how do they react to Cal versus the middle school kid, and what sort of tweaks could be made across those developmental time periods?
Yes, I think as a parent of
Right.
a middle schooler and an elementary school kid right now, I know this to be true. So there are big differences in the ways that they like to engage with learning, especially outside of school. But I think, yeah, a very important point. And I think, we sort of think of this as maybe teeing up that next set of questions around better understanding those differences.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Gibbs, for joining us today and giving us insight into this really interesting work that you're doing and that spans across multiple grade bands too. I think it's really insightful. So thank you very much. For those of us in attendance, we'll have the recording available to you all and we'll reach out with that. And if you are interested in joining for our next brown bag, I have the registration link in here in the chat as well. Thank you very much again, Dr. Gibbs, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks much.